Billionaire followed the black waitress after work. What he saw changed everything. What if a single act of kindness could change 2 lives forever? That's exactly what happened on a cold Tuesday evening in downtown Chicago, when billionaire tech mogul James Whitmore found himself sitting in a worn vinyl booth at Rosie's Diner, watching a waitress named Celeste move between tables with quiet dignity. At 43, James had everything money could buy, yet he felt emptier than the coffee cup growing cold in his hands. Celeste, 36 and working her second job of the day, didn't know that the tired-looking businessman in the corner booth was worth more than most small countries. She simply refilled his cup with the same gentle smile she gave every customer, the same warmth she'd carried through 15 years of serving others while raising her teenage daughter alone. When James left that night, something compelled him to follow her, not out of malice or curiosity, but from a pull he couldn't explain. "Where are you watching from tonight?" James had built his empire on reading people, on understanding what made them tick, but Celeste puzzled him in a way he hadn't experienced in years. During his 3 visits to Rosie's Diner that week, he'd watched her handle difficult customers with patience, comfort a crying child while his mother searched for her wallet, and slip extra bread rolls to the elderly man who nursed one coffee for hours. She moved through her shifts like poetry in motion, never rushing despite the chaos around her. Celeste Washington had been waitressing since she was 21, working her way through nursing school before life took an unexpected turn. Her daughter Tiana, now 15, was her whole world, a bright girl with dreams of becoming a doctor. The medical bills from Tiana's childhood illness had derailed Celeste's nursing career, but she'd never let bitterness creep into her heart. Instead, she poured her caring nature into every interaction, treating Rosie's Diner like it was her own family restaurant. "Mama, you're humming again," Tiana would tease when Celeste came home from work, her feet aching but her spirits surprisingly light. Despite working 2 jobs, the diner during the day and cleaning offices at night, Celeste maintained an optimism that both puzzled and inspired everyone around her. James first noticed her on a particularly busy Friday evening. He ducked into the diner to escape a board meeting that had left him questioning everything about his life's work. His company's latest acquisition had meant layoffs for 300 families, and the weight of those decisions sat heavy on his shoulders. When Celeste approached his table, her genuine concern for his well-being caught him off guard. "You look like you're carrying the world tonight, honey," she'd said softly, setting down his coffee. "Whatever it is, tomorrow's a fresh start." Those simple words, spoken without knowing who he was or what he was worth, had stirred something in James that success and wealth never could. He found himself returning to the diner, not for the mediocre food, but for glimpses of the kind of humanity he'd forgotten existed in his world of corporate boardrooms and hostile takeovers. On this particular Tuesday evening, as Celeste finished her shift at 9:30, James made a decision that would change everything. He waited in his car across the street, watching as she emerged from the diner's back entrance, her shoulders sagging with exhaustion. She walked 6 blocks to the downtown bus stop, her uniform coat pulled tight against the October wind. But instead of boarding the bus that would take her home to her apartment, Celeste kept walking. James followed at a distance, his curiosity growing with each step. She turned down a side street lined with medical buildings, then another turn toward what looked like the old community center. The neighborhood grew rougher, the streetlights dimmer, and James began to worry about her safety. When Celeste finally stopped in front of a run-down building with boarded windows, James felt his heart sink. Was this where she lived? The thought of this remarkable woman calling such a place home made his chest tight with an emotion he couldn't name. But then Celeste pulled out a key, not to enter the building, but to unlock a heavy metal door hidden in the shadows. Light spilled out, and James heard something that made him step closer. The sound of children's laughter echoing through the night. What James discovered behind that metal door challenged everything he thought he knew about wealth, poverty, and the meaning of success. Through the window, he watched Celeste transform from tired waitress to something magical, a woman surrounded by dozens of children, her face bright with joy as she helped them with homework, served bowls of soup, and listened to their stories with the same attention she'd given him at the diner. The basement community center was nothing fancy. Folding tables, mismatched chairs, and walls painted in cheerful colors that couldn't quite hide the water stains. But it was filled with life. Children ranging from 6 to 16 gathered around Celeste as she moved between them, offering encouragement with math problems, bandaging scraped knees, and somehow managing to make each child feel like the most important person in the room. "Miss Celeste, my mama's working late again," a small voice called out. "Can I stay until she comes?" "Of course, baby," Celeste replied, her voice carrying the warmth of 100 grandmothers. "We've got nowhere to be but right here." James learned later that Celeste had started the program 3 years ago when she noticed neighborhood children wandering the streets after school with nowhere safe to go. She'd convinced the building owner to let her use the basement for free in exchange for basic maintenance. Every evening after her diner shift, she'd come here to provide homework help, a hot meal, and something many of these children had never experienced: unconditional care from an adult who expected nothing in return. But as James watched through the window, he noticed things that made his businessman's mind race with concern. The ancient radiator coughed and wheezed, barely keeping the room warm. Extension cords snaked across the floor, overloaded with space heaters and lamps. The children's coats were thin, their shoes worn, and several of them ate their soup with the hunger of those who weren't sure where their next meal would come from. Most heartbreaking of all was watching Celeste divide one sandwich into 4 pieces, insisting she wasn't hungry while making sure the smallest children had enough to eat. Her own stomach growled audibly, but she simply smiled and continued helping with algebra problems as if her own needs didn't matter. Then James witnessed something that nearly brought him to tears. A police officer entered the center, and James's heart stopped, fearing the worst. But instead of shutting them down, Officer Patricia Murphy hung up her coat and began reading stories to the younger children. She was followed by Mrs. Chen from the corner market, carrying bags of day-old bread and bruised fruit, and then by others, a retired teacher, a construction worker still in his hard hat, a grandmother with arthritis who could barely walk but insisted on helping anyway. This was a community in the truest sense. People with almost nothing giving everything they had. If this moment touched your heart, please give the video a thumbs up. As the evening wound down and families began collecting their children, James watched Celeste lock up the center with the care of someone protecting something precious. She checked every window, every door, running her hand along the walls like a mother tucking in a beloved child. When she finally emerged into the cold night air, her exhaustion was complete, but her spirit seemed somehow lighter. James followed her to the bus stop, his mind racing with possibilities he'd never considered before. But what happened next would challenge everything he thought he knew about dignity, pride, and the delicate dance of helping without hurting. The next morning, James couldn't concentrate on quarterly reports or market projections. All he could think about was those children huddled around broken heaters and Celeste dividing her only sandwich. By noon, he'd made a decision that sent his assistant into panic mode. He cleared his entire afternoon schedule and drove back to Rosie's diner. Celeste was there, moving between tables with her usual grace, but James noticed what he'd missed before. The slight limp from standing too many hours, the way she discreetly rubbed her lower back when she thought no one was looking, the careful way she counted her tips, separating them into different envelopes labeled rent, groceries, and center supplies. When the lunch rush ended, James approached her with a proposal that he'd spent all morning crafting. "I'd like to make a donation to your after-school program," he said simply, placing an envelope on the table. Celeste's reaction wasn't what he'd expected. Instead of gratitude, her face clouded with confusion and something that looked like hurt. "I'm sorry, but I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice careful and distant. "I saw you last night at the community center," James continued gently. "What you're doing for those children is remarkable." The envelope sat between them like an accusation. Celeste stared at it, then at James, and he watched as understanding dawned in her eyes. Not excitement or relief, but something much more complex. The painful realization that her privacy had been invaded, that her most sacred space had been witnessed by a stranger. "You followed me?" The words came out barely above a whisper, but they hit James like a physical blow. In her voice, he heard not just violation but the deep sadness of someone who'd learned to trust sparingly and had that trust shaken. "I didn't mean to," James began, but Celeste had already picked up the envelope and was handing it back to him. "Thank you, but no thank you," she said with quiet dignity. "Those children aren't a charity case, and neither am I. We take care of our own." James watched her walk away, his chest tight with the realization of how badly he'd mishandled everything. In his world, problems were solved with money, with grand gestures and quick fixes. But he'd just learned that some things, the most important things, couldn't be purchased. Dignity couldn't be bought. Trust couldn't be acquired through quarterly earnings. That evening, he returned to the diner during Celeste's shift, but she avoided his table, assigning another waitress to serve him. The warm connection they'd begun to build had been severed by his thoughtless action. He'd wanted to help, but instead he'd made her feel exposed and vulnerable. For 3 days, James returned to the diner, not ordering much, just sitting in his booth and hoping for a chance to apologize. But Celeste remained distant, professional but cold. On the 4th day, he almost gave up. Maybe some mistakes couldn't be undone. Maybe he'd lost his chance to be part of something beautiful because he'd approached it like a business transaction instead of a human connection. Have you ever made a mistake that hurt someone you cared about? Let us know in the comments. But then something happened that changed everything. Just as James was preparing to leave the diner for the last time, a small figure burst through the front door, tears streaming down her face, calling for the one person who could make everything better. Miss Celeste. Miss Celeste. They said we can't use the center anymore. The little girl who'd burst into the diner was Maya, 8 years old with pigtails askew and panic in her eyes. Behind her came other children from the community center. Teenagers trying to look tough but clearly shaken, younger kids clinging to their older siblings' hands. They'd walked 12 blocks to find Celeste, the only adult they trusted with their crisis. Slow down, baby, Celeste said, kneeling to Maya's level and smoothing her hair. Tell me what happened. Through hiccuping sobs, Maya explained that city inspectors had visited the community center that afternoon. The building was deemed unsafe, electrical violations, heating problems, structural concerns. They'd posted a notice giving them 48 hours to vacate before the building would be condemned. James watched Celeste's face transform as she absorbed this news. The color drained from her cheeks, but her voice remained steady for the children's sake. Okay. We'll figure this out. We always do. But James could see what the children couldn't, the defeat in Celeste's shoulders, the way her hands trembled as she gathered the children around a corner booth. For 3 years, she'd poured her heart and soul into creating a safe haven for these kids. She'd sacrificed her own comfort, her own dreams, her own future to give them something precious. And now it was being taken away by forces beyond her control. Miss Celeste, said Trevor, a 14-year-old who usually acted too cool to show emotion, what are we gonna do? Where are we gonna go after school? The question hung in the air like a prayer without an answer. Celeste looked around at faces that had become her extended family, children who depended on her for stability in lives that had offered them precious little of it. James watched her struggle to find words of comfort when she had none to give. That's when James made the second most important decision of his life. The first had been following Celeste that night. This one would define who he really was underneath all the wealth and success. He stood up from his booth and approached their table slowly, respectfully. Excuse me, he said softly, addressing Celeste but acknowledging the children with kind eyes. I couldn't help overhearing. Maybe I can help. Celeste looked up at him with a mixture of wariness and desperate hope. Mr. James, he said simply. And I'm not offering charity. I'm offering partnership. What James proposed wasn't a handout but a collaboration. His company owned several properties throughout the city, including a former community center. For the first time in days, Celeste looked at James without walls between them. She saw not a rich man trying to ease his conscience, but someone who understood that the greatest gifts weren't monetary. If you've been enjoying this story, subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales. What exactly are you proposing? She asked, her voice careful but no longer cold. James smiled, feeling more alive than he had in years. I'm proposing we save more than just one community center. Let's build something that can help children all across the city. 6 months later, the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the Chicago Children's Community Initiative drew local news cameras and city officials, but James only had eyes for one person. Celeste stood at the podium in a simple blue dress, addressing a crowd of 200 people with the same natural warmth she'd always shown to one lonely businessman in a diner booth. The new center was everything the old basement hadn't been: safe, bright, fully equipped with computers, a commercial kitchen, and rooms designed specifically for different age groups. But more importantly, it was the first of 5 centers planned across Chicago's underserved neighborhoods, each one designed with input from the communities they would serve. "This isn't just a building," Celeste said into the microphone, her voice carrying clearly across the crowd. "This is proof that when people come together, when they really see each other, miracles happen every single day." James watched the original children from the basement center explore their new home with wonder. Maya, now 9, gave tours to visitors, proudly explaining how the art room worked and where they kept the emergency snacks. Trevor, who'd initially been suspicious of James and his motives, now helped coordinate activities for younger children while maintaining his fierce protectiveness of the space they'd all helped create. The partnership between James and Celeste had grown into something neither of them had expected. She'd left her job at the diner to become the initiative's director, finally able to use her natural gifts for nurturing and organizing on a larger scale. James had discovered that his business skills could be used for something more meaningful than profit margins. They could build bridges between communities that had never trusted each other before. "You know," Celeste said, joining James as he watched the children settle into their after-school routines, "I never did thank you properly for that night you followed me." James shook his head. "I should be thanking you. I was lost before I found that diner. Before I found you." "No," Celeste smiled. "You weren't lost. You were just looking for your purpose in all the wrong places." The truth was, both of their lives had been transformed by that chance encounter. James had learned that wealth without compassion was poverty of the worst kind, while Celeste had discovered that accepting help wasn't weakness, it was wisdom. Together, they'd created something that neither could have built alone. As the evening wound down and families came to collect their children, James reflected on the journey that had brought them all here. It had started with a billionaire's curiosity about a waitress's kindness and had grown into a movement that was changing lives across the city. The initiative had already secured funding for 10 more centers, with partnerships forming in other cities. But the real magic wasn't in the buildings or the programs or even the hundreds of children they now served. It was in the understanding that everyone has something valuable to offer, whether it's money or time or simply the gift of seeing others as they truly are. Human beings worthy of dignity, respect, and love. Standing in the bright warmth of the community center, surrounded by the laughter of children and the quiet satisfaction of adults who'd found their purpose, James finally understood what true wealth looked like. If you enjoyed this story, please remember to like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales. Thank you for joining us on this journey of discovering that sometimes the most valuable things in life can't be bought. They can only be built, one act of kindness at a time.